everybody. I'm Jeff. So Professor Joel Fajans, as you may know, is a distinguished member of our physics department here at Berkeley. As the standard information goes, he has a PhD from MIT. He joined the Berkeley faculty in 1988. He has a very large number of awards that you can find on the website, of course. I won't go through reading them because that's boring. I'm sure the awards aren't boring themselves. So his research is currently involved with trapping anti-hydrogen, and he just gave the talk in the colloquium on Monday, which was that the results that he's trapped anti-hydrogen successfully for 1,000 seconds. And that's not necessarily the lifetime, but that's how long they've trapped it for. So that's great. The lecture you'll hear today is the result of Professor Fajans seeing an article back in the day in the American Journal of Physics, where he noticed that some of the physics in this article on how bicycles work, or how humans ride bicycles, was incorrect. And so he, like any good physicist, went through and did some research, and this lecture is the result of that. So there are some rather surprising results in here, which you'll hear today. It's not a particularly untouched field of physics, but it's definitely one that's commonly misunderstood or not very, or maybe underappreciated. So this is important at all levels of academia. And there's also an additional paper that's related to this called Why Bicyclists Hate Stop Signs, which I encourage you all to look at in case you ever get a speeding ticket or a running stop sign ticket on your bicycle. You can present it in traffic court or something.
It won't help.
All right, and so let's introduce our speaker.
Thank you. This talk will work best if we do it informally, so I'd like to encourage all of you to ask questions. Keep on interrupting me. It's going to be fairly informal, so I'm going to ask a few questions as we go along. But I'd like to start out with a statement, which is that almost all physicists, undergraduates, graduate students, professional physicists, professors of physics, think that they know how a bicycle works. And the reason why they think it is because a bicycle wheel is the canonical example of angular momentum. It turns out that angular momentum in the wheel has almost nothing to do with the way a bicycle behaves. Despite what everybody thinks, it simply doesn't matter very much. So almost all physicists have this wrong. And this has been known for a long time. Actually, very little that I'm going to say in this lecture, if anything, really is original to me. This all has been known for a very long time, but it's just not widely known. It's an interesting problem that affects the way many of us ride a bicycle, obviously. So it's worth discussing. So I'd like to start this conversation out by talking about how you balance a bicycle. So here's, like any bicyclist, I have a number of bicycles, but here's one of them. I don't know how many bicycles, never mind. Okay. So I'd like to ask a very simple question. How do you balance a bicycle? Sounds like a very simple question. And so you're riding along, and for some reason or another, the bicycle perhaps starts to lean over to one side. And obviously would continue to lean over to one side if you let it. So the question is, how do you stop that bicycle from falling over? So somebody who doesn't know the answer, tell me what they think the answer is. Lean to the other side, yeah. That's the obvious thing that you might think would happen. So if the bicycle falls in this direction, the obvious answer is that you would somehow rather lean in the opposite direction like this. Okay? But that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. Because while this isn't precisely an isolated system, what actually happens if I throw my shoulders to the right? The center of my gravity will stay at approximately the same place. So what will actually happen if I throw my shoulders off to the right? The bicycle will fall even further off to the left. It's not precisely true because you can work a little bit on the ground, but basically it's true. So you can't ride a bicycle. You can't ride a bicycle by moving your hips from side to side and expecting that the shifts in the center of gravity that you get from that will cause the bicycle to balance. Okay, so how do you think you actually do it? Actually, there's two ways of thinking about that. They're equivalent ways, but the way I like to think about it is to use, I think there's only one physics professor here, is that correct? There's a concept that we're not allowed to teach in physics anymore called centrifugal force. Because it's considered a dirty, confusing subject. But it really makes a lot of sense in this particular context. If the bicycle falls over to the side, what you actually do is you turn into the direction of the fall. What does that do? It starts the bicycle going around in a curve like this. And what happens when you go around a curve? Say in a car, you've all felt this. What happens? You feel a force which presses you to the outside of the curve, right? So what actually happens when you go around the curve is you're going around this curve and you feel a centrifugal force which tends to right the bicycle back up. Now, of course, that doesn't work all that well because it's hard to stop it, the straight up and down, so chances are you fall in the opposite direction. So what do you think you do at that point? You turn the handlebars back into the lean again, and that creates another centrifugal force which points in the opposite direction. So actually, the process of balancing a bicycle, which we do entirely subconsciously, is a process of turning the handlebars from side to side to create these centrifugal forces. Or, as somebody said a moment ago, there's another way of thinking about it. You can think about it in exactly the same way as you balance a meter stick in your hand. If the meter stick starts to fall in one direction, what do? You move the meter stick under. I can't watch you guys balance at the same time, but if the meter stick starts to fall in this direction, a way of thinking about it is that you move the meter stick, the bottom of the meter stick underneath. Right? Well, it's really the same concept. There's just two different ways of thinking about it. If the bicycle starts to fall in this direction, you steer in that direction, and what does that do? It moves the bottom of the bicycle underneath you, and that rights you back up. Okay? Now, if you don't believe me about this, perhaps you've seen the tracks of a bicycle left in sand or in water. Anybody ever been down to seen a bicycle down at the beach? Somebody that's left tracks in the sand at the beach or on a wet road?
Is it one straight and one squiggly, relatively speaking?
Well, that could be, but the point that I want to make about it is that there's squiggly lines, and they're crossing each other constantly. Is that familiar to people? They're crossing each other constantly. The deviations from a straight line are only, a couple of inches. But all of those crosses are the subconscious adjustments that somebody makes as they're turning the handlebars. First they go one way, then they go the other way. And the net result is the bicycle stays upright. Okay, so is that plausible to people how we do this? So there are a couple of interesting conclusions that you can reach from this. I'm not going to use very much math in this lecture, but I will use just a little bit here. Does anybody know the formula? Well, I hope that since many of these are my students that you know the formula for this. What's the formula for centrifugal force? The force that you get when you go around a corner is proportional to your mass, which we're not going to care about. The velocity squared divided by the radius around which you're going, right? So, if you're turning a corner like this, you're going around some circle that's got some large radius like that, and you're going with some velocity v in this direction. The faster you go, the greater the force you get, right? That comes straight out of this formula. Alternately, if you want to get the same size force, and you're going at some fixed speed, what you can do is, if you want to get the same size force as the velocity increases, you're allowed to go around a bigger and bigger circle. In other words, turn your handlebars less and less, right? If I'm going at a speed of 10, that makes this 100. Let's say I want to get 1 out of here, so R would be 100. But if I'm going at a speed of 20, that's 400. So R could be equal to 40 to get the same sorts of numbers out. So what's the impact of this? Well, this explains why it's very, very difficult to teach a child how to ride a bicycle. Because the slower you go, the more you have to turn the handlebars to get the same forces to right yourself back up. If you're going really fast, a very small variation of the handlebars, which will create a very, very large turning radius, R, will be sufficient to get enough forces to right the bicycle back up. But any of you who've ever tried, I'm sure you've all done this, if you try and ride very, very slowly, you really have to turn the handlebars a great deal to get, once again, this is actually easier to do when people aren't watching you. See, as soon as I started moving, it became much easier. I didn't have to turn the handlebars nearly as much. This is a little bit of a complicated thing. There's other things going on, but the basic reason is from this formula. So teaching a kid to ride a bicycle is to some extent an act of teaching them to trust themselves to go fast, because the faster they go, the easier it is for them to do it. Okay? So if that's how you balance a bicycle, let's talk about how you would steer a bicycle. Let's say you deliberately want to go to the right, riding along in this direction, and you deliberately want to turn off to the right. How do you think you do that? Well, the obvious answer is you turn the handlebars to the right. So what happens if you turn the handlebars to the right? You're going to fall over in this direction, right? Because there'll be a centrifugal force which will push you in this direction. In fact, this is a cause of a very common accident on bicycles called a diversion fall. If there's something in the road, like, say, train tracks, and you're riding along, and you hit the train track, and you're not holding onto the wheel, the train tracks will turn your wheel off to the side, and you immediately fall on your face. There's nothing you can do about it. If the wheel gets diverted like this, you're going to fall. So it doesn't do the trick. It doesn't work to suddenly turn the handlebars. You have to do something else, something more sophisticated than that. What you obviously somehow have to do is what? Get the bicycle to lean over. Because if you get the bicycle to lean over, then you can have canceling forces. If I want to turn in this direction and I lean the bicycle in the direction of the lean, then there are two forces at play. There's the gravitational forces which want to drop the bicycle in this direction, and there's the centrifugal forces which want to balance the bicycle back up. You can establish an equilibrium, or a quasi-equilibrium this way, and safely go around the turn. And it's easy, for instance, via that formula over there to calculate exactly what angles you have to be at and how far you have to lean the bicycle over. It's not that interesting a thing to do. But the interesting question is, how do you create the lean? How do you get the bicycle to lean over? Well, some of you obviously know the answer. But the thing that people probably think at first, anyway, if they don't know what the right answer is they think that if I want to cause the bicycle to lean like that, they think that you just shift your weight somehow or other. But that comes back to the point that I was making in the beginning of this, which is that if you shift your weight to one side, your center of gravity doesn't really shift. Yes?
You have to turn in the opposite direction before you make the turn then?
That's exactly correct. You turn in the opposite direction. This is called counter-steering. People who ride motorcycles are actually taught this if they go to motorcycling school, but bicyclists are generally unaware of this. What you actually do to make a right turn is you turn the handlebars in the left direction. That creates a centrifugal force which pushes the bicycle over in this direction, and once the bicycle has been pushed over in this direction, you either turn the handlebars or allow the handlebars to turn in this direction, and now everything's fine because you're leaning in the right direction and you're going around in the curve. So counter steering is what we all do. We're pretty much unaware of it. It's a completely subconscious motion for many of us. But some of you who spent, those of you who spent a good deal of time on a bicycle may recognize a certain phenomenon. Have you ever been riding along and for some reason or other find yourself very, very close to an edge in the road, a curve?
You can't escape.
You can't escape it. Who's felt this sensation? You're really right next to the curve and you feel like you're glued to the curve. So who's felt this? A good fraction of you have all felt this. So what's the reason for that? You can't counter steer. You may not know that you may not know consciously that you have to counter steer, but somehow or another your body knows that you have to counter steer, and it won't let you because you fall off the curb. Yes?
Why do they teach counter steering to motorcycles? Because the forces are so much greater, you have to really jump on it?
I think because I'm not a motorcyclist. I'm told that it's more obvious on a motorcycle. The other thing is that
V is much higher, so definitely.
V is much, I mean, a lot of things are different. The wheels weigh a lot more. A lot of things are different, but I'm told that you actually actively have to push the handlebars.
You won't steer a motorcycle without counter-steering. You really physically have to move the water.
Yeah, so you kind of wrestle. The other thing, of course, going on is that you need a license to ride a motorcycle. and so people are, you've got to, there are schools for there are very few schools for bicycling. There actually are some schools for bicycle riding in this area. Grizzly Peak Cyclists seems to run some of them, but they're fairly rare. So anyway, the problem here is that you can't turn into the curve. So you've got to wait for something else. Either you turn very, very gradually, so it takes a very, very long time for the wheel to turn, or perhaps there's some imperfection in the road or something like that. The wind comes along and knocks you over to the side. And then once you're leaning over to the side, then you can steer away from that edge. Yes?
That's sort of my question. How much counter steering do you need to do just to disturb the equilibrium, or what?
You don't have to do very much at all, typically. Especially if you're not in a hurry to make a curve. I mean, if you go to bicycle racers and people that go to a bicycle handling course will be told, for instance, that if they want to avoid an obstacle, that you counter steer really hard just before it. So first you swerve one way and then you swerve the other to avoid an obstacle. You may do this. You may have already done this yourself. This is the reason.
But is it just to disturb the equilibrium?
Yeah, just to get the bicycle to lean over. So if you're in an emergency situation where there's something in a cinder block in the middle of the road in front of you, and you want to turn,
but if you have bad luck and perturbation, the wind goes the other way, you'll hit the curb and flip over. So you want to get out of it before too much longer.
That's right. I mean, there are, I think, other ways taking advantage of the fact that the wheel is touching the ground, so that moving your center of mass can have small, slow effects on this. But they are small and rather slow. But for those of you who don't believe me about this, I propose some homework, okay? Find a street around here which has a gradual downhill. Monterey is actually a good street for this. Anybody know where Monterey is? It's off on the north side of Berkeley. It's got a gradual descent. There's not much traffic on it. There are very wide shoulders. And what I want you to do is to ride down Monterey. And get yourself going about 15 or 20 miles an hour. And what I want you to do is to let go with one hand, okay? Let's say we let go with this hand. So you're now riding with one hand, you can do that. And then let go with the other hand, and with the back of your hand, I want you to push on the handlebars, okay? So I'm pushing like this with the back of my hand. Clearly, if I'm pushing like this, I can only be turning the handlebars to the right in this case. And if you've managed to calm yourself down enough on the bicycle so you're steady and you're not fluttering around, I promise you that if you push to the right, push like this, you'll actually wind up going in the opposite direction. Countersteering really works. Yes?
So how do people ride bicycles without their hands?
We'll get to that. Okay. This actually explains another thing about why it's so hard to teach kids to ride a bicycle. And the reason why it's hard is we teach them exactly the wrong things first. Because we teach kids to ride a tricycle or a bicycle with training wheels. So with training wheels, you can ignore all of this, or on a tricycle, you can ignore all of this. If you've got training wheels and you turn the handlebars in this direction, what happens? The bicycle starts to fall over, but the training wheel takes over. And you can just keep on going like this. So the instincts that a child learns with training wheels or on a tricycle are exactly backwards from what they actually need to have. They need to learn this counter steering, and they don't, because there's no need to do that. There is, in fact, you may have seen around Berkeley, kids on bicycles that look like tiny little bicycles, but they have no pedals on them. I'm sorry?
Like velocipedes.
Yes, exactly. Have you anybody see these? They're often made out of wood, which is, yeah, really annoying that they're made out of wood, because they're expensive. There's some fine European product when I wanted, you know, a $20 bicycle from China or something like that. But those actually make much more sense for teaching a child to bicycle, because those have all of the right instincts. There are no training wheels on them. The pedals don't get in the way, so the kid can always put their feet down so they're not scared. And so they can learn all of the balancing instincts, and then it's just a simple matter of getting them a bicycle with pedals, and they'll already know how to steer and balance. And so they'll be able to go around. It's a much more sensible route than the typical American route of giving a kid training wheels. It comes from Europe, this way of teaching them. These wooden things are made in Scandinavia or someplace, and you'll see a lot more of them over there than here. Are there any questions so far? We should really try and keep this interactive and more fun for everybody. We were pointing at something.
He asked, how do we steer without hands?
You didn't answer this.
Oh, I didn't answer
And you'll get to that.
I will get to that eventually. Yes?
Does track standing work with the same principle of centrifugal force?
No, I'll get to track that.
So I have a sense sometimes in a long streaky descending curve that I can just, I don't know, it's also with my heels, that I can just kind of take the curve by counter steering and just kind of gently hold me to counter steer. I don't know if I'm really doing that or if I then am correcting. It's probably sort of a banked sweeping curve. Am I probably just initiating the counter steer and then doing something else? Or
Okay, well that's actually the next thing I'd really like to go to, which is, some of you may be wondering, I said that if I push the handlebar with the back side of my hands, that's counter steering, obviously. All right? I said that even though the handlebar turned to the right, I'll turn left. Okay? Now, ultimately, obviously, the wheel has to go to the left. Everybody agree? So the question is, why does that happen? If I'm just pushing like this, there's no possibility of my ever pulling the handlebars back. That's why I want you to use the back of your hand for this experiment. And yet, the wheel, in fact, does turn in the proper direction. And this is actually the most important design element in a bicycle that it does this. It's something called the trail, which I'd like to describe to you next. It accounts for, the reason why this happens basically is that if I lean a bicycle over, the handlebar turns in the proper direction without my actually doing anything. You all know this, right? Go like this, the handlebar leans. It's why, for instance, if you're walking a bicycle along, you can steer it, right? I can do whatever I want, you know, walk down the corridor just by holding up the seat, and by leaning it in the proper direction, I can get the wheel to turn in all of the proper directions. So that's the magic of a bicycle. And this has to do with something fundamental about the way bicycles are designed, which I'd like to show you next. So, could I have some help? Could you help me with this? Yeah. I just want you to hold the bicycle up. Just hold this seat like that. If you take a look at a bicycle, there's two interesting points that I'd like to talk about. One of them is the steering axis of the bike. The steering axis of the bike is the line that's defined not by the fork, but by this head tube over here, and it's the line around which the handlebars turn. Okay? And I can project that line down to the ground. In fact, I can kind of use a laser beam to project that line down to the bottom of the ground. Something like this. If I line this up, I can project it downwards. Okay? So that's one interesting place that we'd like to keep in mind, is where the steering axis hits the ground, which is somewhere over here. The other interesting place that I'd like you guys to think about is where the wheel hits the ground. They're not necessarily the same place. In fact, on all modern bicycles, they are not the same place. The steering axis actually trails where the wheel hits the ground, and the distance that it trails is called the trail. It is the most important parameter in the design of the bicycle. In fact, it's the only thing that really, really matters in the bicycle. And it took about 50 years for bicycle designers to get this right. In fact,
I think you said it backwards. The tire contact is behind.
The tire contact is behind.
The extended.
What did I say?
You just said it.
I'm sorry, I apologize for that. Let me put this back up. That should be obvious if I had done this correctly. The wheel is sitting right over here, and the projection is somewhere in front. Okay, I'm sorry, I really screwed that up, apparently. In the mid-70s, I think it was, a guy named Jones in Physics Today published the only piece of original research that's ever been published in Physics Today, as far as I know. For those of you who are not physicists, Physics Today is the sort of society journal of the American Physical Society. And what he did is he measured the trail on all sorts of historical bicycles. He went to many, many different museums around the world and looked at old bicycles, some of them 150 years old, some of them newer, and measured that trail. And originally, as a function of time, what he found is that the trails in the beginning of the first bicycles were all over the place. But eventually they converged to a fairly narrow range as people understood that this was the only important parameter in a bicycle. So when you go out and buy a bicycle, it's kind of funny. The salesman will tell you all about the fancy series that you have. You know, I have Ultegras because this is my midlife crisis bike. And they'll tell you about the handlebars. They'll tell you
midlife crisis?
I'm sorry?
Where's your Dura-Ace?
I'm a physics professor. We can't afford Dura-Ace. They'll tell you that the frame, you'll have endless discussions about whether you should buy a steel frame or a carbon fiber frame or an aluminum frame or a titanium frame. But they'll never mention the trail, which is the only thing, as I keep on saying, that really matters. And why is it? It's because the trail is what's responsible for this automatic steering behavior in the bicycle. Without it, the bicycle is essentially unrideable. And the easiest way to show you that it's the trail that's responsible for this is to think about the torques around the steering axis. So if you could help me again, what I'm going to do is to lean the bicycle way over on its side. And let's think about how this works. Way over on its side, the steering axis is over here, right? The point of contact is over here. So there are forces from the ground on the wheel which are pointing upwards at this point. And those forces will create a torque around the steering axis, right? In which direction is that torque pointing? It's pointing in this direction. And so that's what does the automatic correction on the bicycle. That's what causes the wheel to turn in the proper direction. If you screw the trail up, the bicycle becomes unrideable. And I had our machine shop make a bicycle with the trail screwed up, this bicycle over here. After this talk, we can go downstairs and you guys can try and ride it. It is possible to ride this bicycle in a straight line, but it's exceedingly difficult to take it around the curve. And you are an unfortunate victim right at this point. I'll have you ride it across the classroom.
Ride it?
No. Actually, I'm just going to don't worry. What's your name?
Mark.
Mark, can you stand up for a second? I just want you to take my bicycle for a second. And bring it back here. And Mark, I just want you to roll it across the classroom, but only holding onto the saddle. You know how to do this. Okay, bring it back, or just leave it at that end. Lean it against the walls again. Okay, now try and do the same thing with this one. No, you can't touch the handlebar.
You can't do that. You're automatically steering away. I see.
I've set this poor Mark up. He can't do it. You can retreat a little bit if you want.
He could pull the bicycle backwards.
You can do it.
Thank you. I would never try to do that. I know better. But anyway, afterwards you can all come out and try and ride this bicycle if you wish. It can be done, but it's really, really hard. It's really tiring, actually. And the reason is the trail is pointing in the wrong direction. So instead of correcting when you go in the right direction, it actually corrects in the wrong direction. So the next question you could ask is, what size trail do you want? We know the trail should be positive, because that's what makes the bicycle steer properly. But should it be large or should it be small? What do you think?
Should depend on the projected speed that you ride, shouldn't it?
Well, perhaps the speed, but I would say more on the activity.
The size of the wheel.
And the size of the wheel, obviously. But within, the same size speed and the same size wheel.
So
Yes.
maybe you want your bike to be responsive, in some cases not so responsive. So if you're touring, you want it to be not too responsive, not too twitchy,
That's right.
in a sense.
So touring bikes, in fact, have a relatively long trail so that they're not twitchy. That means that they'll self-correct. You don't have to push on the handlebars very much, so you don't tire your arms out. A real racing bike, this isn't quite a racing bike frame, but it's close to a racing bike frame. Racers want a very, very responsive bicycle. Why is that? Because they're riding in a pack of 100 people at 35 miles an hour, and they're just about to crash at all times. So they really need to have a very responsive bicycle. And so they have very, very short trails on their bicycles. There's always a trade-off in engineering, as you may know, between stability and performance, right? Your grandfather's Cadillac will go right down the center of the road forever, but it will not take the turns very well. while you know, the rich bankers, Lotus, whatever, is very, very maneuverable but not very stable. It won't go down a road of various straits. The same is true for instance, for airplanes. Modern fighter aircraft are actually unstable because they want to make them very, very maneuverable. So they can only be, there's always a computer that's correcting and keeping the plane flying in a proper direction. If there wasn't for the computer there, the planes would be unstable and they would crash. So they have to have it straight up. Yes?
Are track bicycles built differently? The track competition is between two bicycles. The only thing that matters is crossing the finish line on a fixed number of turns, and they have to go to a dead stop before the last turn. Are they built differently?
I'd imagine they are. I don't know specifically what they do with the trail in that case. I've never ridden a track bicycle.
They steer a lot quicker even than racing bike.
Okay, so then they would have essentially no trail, I would guess. What about a mountain bike? Do you think it has a long trail, short trail, maneuverable, stable?
Short.
Okay, that's the obvious thing, that you would want the bicycle to be maneuverable. It actually is wrong. You want the bicycle to be stable, and that's because the terrain is rough. When you hit a rock, you don't want to crash. You want the bicycle to self-correct for that rock, so those typically have fairly longish trails. Yes?
Trails set by the head tube angle and the sweep. So what does the head tube angle do? You can get the same trail with almost any head tube angle.
I'm out of my depth with that question. The question is, especially back in the old days, forks were generally had a sort of J shape, and you could move the wheel back and forth and change the trail by changing the size of that J at the bottom of the fork, as well as by changing the head tube angle. And how they came up with the various compromises there, I don't actually know. Yes?
In your bicycle, the handlebars are located forward from the head tube. So it's in between, so the location of the handlebars is in between the contact points and the trail contact point and the trail projection point and the tire point.
That's right, but where the handlebars doesn't affect this aspect. They could be fairly far off. It wouldn't affect this particular aspect of how the bicycle rides, because the trail is not affected by where the handlebars actually are. It's the stem tube length is basically set because they want you to lean over into a racing position. But on the other hand, you know, I'm getting gray, and bending all the way over is starting to hurt. So
I think the regular fork has zero shock absorbing.
that's right. It certainly did, and in the good old days, I think the J at the end was to give you some shock absorbing capability. Nowadays, this is a carbon fiber fork, as most forks are on higher end bicycles now, and they can do the same thing by, first of all, you notice that this is at an angle compared to the head tube. So that gives you some shock absorbing right there. And in addition to that, you can wind the fibers so that they're more flexible in this direction, which is good for shock absorbing, than not in this direction, which would lead to instabilities in the bicycle. So there are more options available with carbon fiber than there used to be. Let's talk about one more type of bicycle, I guess, which is what I would call it, you know, I'm a bike snob, I won't deny it, what I'll call a department store bicycle. Department store bicycles actually have very long trails. And the reason for this is that people don't get to ride them, except perhaps surreptitiously down the aisles of the department store, where they can only go in straight lines. So to make those bicycles easy to ride down their department store aisles, maybe this is too cynical of me, but to make them easy to ride, they make the trails really long, which makes them very stable. But as soon as you get out of the department store and take them around the bend, it's going to be rather hard, because they're so stable they won't maneuver very well. Questions about this? Yes.
So is the trail also responsible for the second
self-correcting? Like once the wheel starts turning, once you're banked into the turn, it has to obviously go. The wheel has to obviously straighten out. Because if it kept turning,
yeah, eventually the wheel has to.
The contact point on the ground, it seemed like, then moved in front of the other axis.
There is an equilibrium, obviously. The wheel doesn't turn all the way, right?
Yeah.
You can actually feel this if you take your bicycle and lean it over. If you go in either direction, the bicycle rises up. If you carefully put your hand on the seat, this is another way for the physicists here. The potential energy increases. There's a potential energy minimum with the angle set at some particular angle. You go one way, the bicycle goes up. You go the other way, the bicycle goes up. So you're right, there's some, but in the end, you do have to push the wheel back in the opposite direction to straighten out from the curve. Okay, so I've been promising to explain how you ride no hands. Yes?
When he was pushing the unrideable bike and had trouble with it, is it just a matter of getting used to being in the opposite way that you're thinking you should? You could trick yourself into doing that, you could then push it just as easily?
Okay, I think that if you're pushing it like this from the back, yes, that is the fact. But it is not the case that just getting used to it works when you're actually trying to ride it. And the reason for that has to do with this potential energy argument that I was just making a moment ago. You want to go in this direction, and the wheel wants to turn in the wrong direction. It actually takes a lot of force and a lot of work. You can, Mark, you can come here again. You're my victim on this bicycle. Put your hand on the seat, okay? And you should be able to feel this. As I turn the handlebar, the seat rises up. Yeah, but in particular, it rises up, right? So you actually have to lift your body up to get the wheel to turn in the right, and that's incredibly tiring. So it's not a matter of getting used to it. It's a matter of, you can get used to it. That's why you can ride it if you practice long enough, but it's really tiring to ride it. Okay, so how do you ride no hands? Actually, it's built of steel, right? You can let it crash on the ground and nothing will happen. I'm not entirely sure how you ride no hands, to tell you the truth, but I spent an hour or two about 10 years ago in a parking lot trying to figure it out. And I think I know the answer, but I'm not entirely certain. The first thing to realize is that I believe that you lead with your shoulders. Okay, in other words, if I want to turn in this direction, I put my shoulders in this direction. So what does that do? If I'm leading like this, if I put my shoulders in this direction, what happens to my hips? They go the other way. So the bike leans the other way. What happened to the steering wheel? It initiated the counter steering. So I go around like this for a while, and counter steering then pushes the bicycle over, right? In the direction I want to go. And then what happens? What happens is that the wheel then turns in the direction that I want to go. And I can take that direction around the curve. So I believe that this is how you steer no hands. You lead with your shoulders. That creates a lean. That lean creates a counter steering. Counter steering tilts the bicycle the way you want to go. Then the trail moves the handlebars back in the direction you want to go. You go around the curve. And then to straighten the bicycle out, you obviously have to lean in the opposite direction. Yes?
We're always taught to sit quite upright and with our weight back when riding no hands. And what does that do with the weight bias and the steering?
I don't know. I mean, there are some simple things that you can say about bicycles, which I'm trying to say today, but then it obviously gets incredibly complicated really quickly. And I don't know the details of that. But I will, yes?
Isn't riding with no hands the same as what Mark was doing, pushing it, just holding onto the seat?
Well, yes, except that Mark has his feet firmly planted on the ground, so A, he doesn't have to worry about crashing. Well, actually, he did. He doesn't have to worry about falling off, but the other thing is that he can, since his feet are on the ground, he can move the bicycle over at any angle that he wants. So it's a lot simpler in principle to do it that way. But for us old guys in the audience, well, I'm old. I won't say anybody else is old. Have you noticed that it's become much harder as you've gotten older to ride no hands? Anybody agree with me about that?
It's also harder to hit 3-point shots.
True. But I'm going to offer you an excuse for your old age, okay? You probably are riding a more expensive bicycle than when you were a kid. That's right? It has a shorter trail because more expensive bicycles are more maneuverable. They have shorter trails.
Yeah, because my climb single speed is really easy.
Okay, so what does the shorter trail get? You have more maneuverability, less stability. So with a more expensive bicycle will respond a lot slower to this sort of hip motion than a cheap bicycle. Therefore, they're harder to ride no hands. Now, haven't I made your day? Yeah. It's not old age. It's expensive tap. I'm sorry?
You can just solve the 3-point problem.
I can't solve the 3-point problem. So the secret is to get a cheap old bicycle if you want to ride no hands. Now, this doesn't, of course, explain how it is that bicycle racers can do things like take their jackets off in the middle of the pack.
Fearless.
Yeah, that probably helps.
There's some technique.
Do those concepts apply the same to riding a unicycle?
I think that riding a unicycle, which I also don't do, it's one of the things I'd really like to learn how to do in my, to learn how to ride a unicycle. I think it has more to do with the way you do this. Basically,
you still need to turn.
I'm sorry? Yeah, but what impresses us in a unicycle is how they stay stationary. And if you notice, what they do is they go backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards. And I think what they're trying to do is just to adjust the wheel so that it's underneath them at all times. And when they're moving along, they're still doing that. But it's a better way of thinking about it than
I think
concepts.
the turning is relying on the friction of the wheel on the ground so you jerk your upper body. I don't ride a unicycle, but I've watched a lot of them. You jerk your upper body and it causes the wheel to skid, and then you bring your body back slowly so the wheel will stay.
You don't mean skid in this direction, you mean skid.
Rotating.
Rotating skid. Yeah, sure.
And then it's not entirely reversible because if you do it slowly, it won't scooch on the ground as you did to turn the first one.
Sure.
There's also gyroscopic forces going on in unicycles, right?
Well,
there's a man in Berkeley, or there was, who made this thing called the Riot Wheel, which is a motorized unicycle. And had a big flywheel that would tilt in whatever perpendicular axis to the way that you wanted to turn, then it would rotate the wheel.
Okay, I started out this lecture by saying that gyroscopic forces and angular momentum had no impact whatsoever on riding a bicycle. That's a lie. It has a small impact, but it's not what people commonly think. I'll show you what the major impact is. This is perhaps just for the physicists here, but let's say you're riding along, the wheel is moving along, right? And if the bicycle tilts over, that's trying to change the axis, right, around which the gyroscope is running. So who knows, who can tell me what's going to happen if I try and tilt the axis of a gyroscope like this? It's going to try and turn the handlebars, right? And it turns out that it wants to turn the handlebars in the appropriate direction. So two things actually help make the wheel go in the right direction when you leave the bicycle over. The first and most important one is the trail, the one we've just been discussing. But if you're moving fast enough, then the gyroscopic forces also assist in moving the wheel in the proper direction. Okay, and I'll close with just one more thing. Why do you think gyroscopic forces don't matter in a bicycle? Obviously, if I was to take the wheel off the bicycle and I could roll it as a hoop across the room, and the thing that would balance it would be, in fact, gyroscopic forces. So why doesn't it matter on a bicycle?
Because
Even,
Because you weigh a lot more than a bike
yeah,
does.
because I weigh like 200 pounds, and the bicycle wheel, I paid a lot of money to make that bicycle wheel weigh as little as possible. It simply doesn't have enough mass to appreciably have a lot of gyroscopic, those forces are just tiny. They're not tiny for an isolated wheel that you roll across a classroom, but they're tiny relative to my mass, so that's why they don't matter.
V squared over R, as that V goes up, and that mass is constant, more or less, those forces are going to be large compared to your mass, which is just going along that V.
It's going to take a lot. It's not that, I'm not saying it can't happen on a motorcycle, it's more likely to happen because the wheel, there's no, I don't think people pay extra money to make motorcycle wheels light.
Oh, yes, they do. Oh,
Pushes the tire,
better believe
more
it.
mass.
Okay, sorry, my ignorance here, but they're still much, much heavier than on a bicycle.
But I mean, a motorcycle weighs a few hundred pounds.
That's right. So,
Someone
You
said,
double,
yeah.
you take somebody that weighs 200 pounds and you make them weigh 400 pounds. But you're still talking about, power relations versus weight.
but it's still, I think, if you, for instance, calculate the amount of energy, which is not the same as angular momentum, but if you calculate the amount of energy that you put into the wheel because it's spinning, it's twice what you would get for the same amount of mass, which is not spinning. It's not a huge effect. So,
But somebody's actually done a study where they mounted a flywheel running backwards.
that's correct. So this guy, Terry Jones, who did this article in Physics Today in which he mapped out all of the trails, actually took a bicycle and mounted counter-rotating wheels to next to the real wheels to actually cancel out all of the gyroscopic forces on the bicycle. And he claimed that the bicycle behaved more or less the way a normal bicycle would behave. I'd love to get the machine shop to build one of those for me. Well, that was, no, and it was quite rideable. It just felt like a normal bicycle. So are there questions? Yes?
I want to know all about body English.
Was this related to, I mean, you can turn with a bike upright and you leave yourself way in, or the way someone might turn an adult bicycle or something like that. Or, but yeah, I mean, some of your hot bike safety classes when it's wet out, keep the bike upright and just leave your body in.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the no hand, it's getting into the no hands discussion, right? You can do more than the counter steering. You can shift your body weight. It has subtle things, and they work. You can ride no hands, but they're small compared to what you actually push on the handlebars typically. Now, if you just have a gradual descent, maybe the small things are enough, and you can get away with it. Nobody has ever made a fully instrumented bicycle. People have made partially instrumented bicycles and tried to record what people actually do on a bicycle. But it would be actually very tough to make a fully instrumented bicycle because you would also have to monitor what the person's body position is. So you have to have cameras on it and those targets that you see in the car crash ads and things like that. If you did all of that, we might be able to find out exactly what it is that people do. But nobody's done it yet. It would be a fair amount of work to do that. Yes?
There's a hill climbing method where you stand up. Does center of gravity have any effect on the design of the bicycle, the location of the main hub and the pedals?
Well, as you probably know, if you've ever attempted to climb Marin, in addition to complete exhaustion, the biggest problem is falling backwards, right? So you obviously have to keep the center of mass preferably somewhere between the two wheels. And when you're on Marin gets to 22%, I think. And that can be problematic because if you're sitting at the back of your seat, then your center of mass. I mean, surely you've done this on a really steep hill. If you pedal too hard, the bicycle, the front wheel lifts off the ground.
Actually, I've more commonly observed the opposite.
I'm sorry?
Or you lean way
Particularly
forward and you
on
sink
an
into
off-road bike, on a mountain bike, I tend to put my weight on the handlebars, and I don't have enough weight on the rear wheel, so the rear wheel starts to slip as I get to steeper and steeper grades.
That's if you're going downhill.
No, it's going uphill, I can
Well,
actually.
you tear the dirt, you tear the soil out too. I mean, you
Yeah,
Right.
it's
you
just
break
a lack
loose.
of traction.
But that's because of not sufficient weight on the rear wheel, because I'm leaning so far forward.
Sure.
It's all rider position.
Yeah. I mean, so in answer to your question, body English matters, but it gets very complicated very quickly. And I can't,
My most pressing question is, as a motorcyclist, I was taught to always lean towards the inside of the turn. Because this has the effect of moving the center of gravity towards the inside of the turn, which means you can stand the bike up more for a given speed and radius, which preserves, gives you a better contact edge.
that's right. But by motorcycle, I've already proven a fool about saying things about motorcycles already, but I'll hazard one more statement, which is bicycle, motorcycle tires are relatively flat, like car tires, are they not? I mean, compared to a bicycle tire, which is completely round.
They're completely round.
They're completely
Sport
round.
bikes? No, the radial tires got, yeah, got something further to it. Yeah.
What about the second contact patch underweight? Is that?
Actually, on a bicycle, you're spreading speed, you get a lot better control. If you lean slightly into the turn, I'm sorry, lean away from the turn, so you're actually pushing the bike down. So when you're trying to steer very slowly, you lean into the turn so the bicycle's standing up. Try it. It was astounding to me how effective that was. Going downhill, going speed, you lean the bike into the turn, you lean out of it. And at slow speeds, like you're trying to do a U-turn on the street, do the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly see pictures of motorcycle racers who are actively falling off the side of their bicycle. They're clearly trying to keep their motorcycle, they're clearly trying to keep the motorcycle upright. And it probably does have something to do with the contact patch in some detail. I think these questions are kind of subtle, exactly, and they're learned through experience, over the years, people try these things.
Well, the thing I was just going to say is that it comes back to the centrifugal force you're talking about. When the motorcycle is passing you the corner, the more you're fighting that centrifugal force. So the more leverage you have on the inside of the bike, the more control over you have.
If you lower the center of
Right,
gravity,
you lower the center.
then it has a shorter torque on.
I know, but I'm just saying the faster you go around that corner, the more you're going to have to get off on the inside.
Well, the more the center of mass has to lean over, but you can do that by leaning the bike or leaning yourself. But the center of mass certainly has to be over.
There's only so far you can lean the motorcycle before you start screaming.
Isn't the same true on a bicycle?
I don't think you're fighting as much force is the difference. So.
Well, I have actually broken my elbow by leaning the bicycle over too far. The very first time I rode this bicycle, it's a long story, but United Airlines had lost my pedals, so I had a pair of standard normal pedals on, and those are wider, and I forgot that they're wider and you can't pedal through a curve in them because your pedal will hit the ground. And I pedaled through a curve, the pedal hit the ground, and I crashed and broke my elbow. So, yes, these things can happen on a
Maybe
motorcycle.
if you've been hanging off to the inside of the curve.
Yeah. Okay, look, this has gone on. It's 5 o'clock. Those of you who want to, I can answer more questions. We can go outside and try this bicycle if you're daring. So thanks for coming. I hope you learned something.